Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Dean Borg, and we have just seen a preview of the Great War, which will be airing on PBS nationwide and on Iowa Public Television on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of this coming week from 8 to 10 o'clock each night. And now we're convening a panel of Iowans who aren't from World War I, of course, but these are people who can give us a perspective of how World War I set the stage, if you will, for America's involvement in other wars. And we're going to be contrasting what they experienced in World War II, Vietnam, Afghanistan, and then we have a historian here who has studied World War I and is going to give us a perspective of what he's been able to glean in history and set the perspective for us. And that person is down on the far end of our panel. He's Mike Vogt. He's curator of the Gold Star Military Museum out at Camp Dodge in Johnston, Iowa. He's from Gladbrook. And Mike, just a brief summary here, when did you first start getting interested in World War I? And give us a little bit about how extensive is your research?
I've had an interest in the First World War. My grandfather was a World War I veteran, but before anyone draws any conclusions, he fought for the other side. He was a German soldier and immigrated here in 1921, so word of mouth from my father and grandmother, I heard anecdotes about his experience, so that got me interested somewhat early on. Also intrigued by an anecdote that was shared in a history class at UNI that Merle Hay was one of the first 3 Americans and the first Iowan to die in World War I. So off and on I have studied and revisited that topic.
You mentioned a name there that when you said Merle Hay, I think of that as a place where I exit Interstate 80.
Yes.
So Merle Hay Road is named for
Merle David Hay, who was a 20-year-old that enlisted in the Army in May of 1917 from Glidden, Iowa, and came to Camp Dodge to take his Army physical, was worried about flat feet, that would prevent him from serving Uncle Sam. He passed his medical physical, was assigned to the 1st Division, was among the first unit sent to France in support of the Allies in World War I, and in November of 1917, that would cost his life in a trench raid.
And I'm going to show you just how flexible we are. I was sitting in the lobby of Iowa Public Television just before convening this panel, about 3 hours ago, sitting there, and a gentleman walked in. He's the next one here in line on our panel. His name is Richard Peterson. He brought in some albums, and then he started talking with me, and I find out that here Richard Peterson is a World War II veteran, and serendipitously, he was born in 1917. So on August 10th of this year, Richard Peterson will be 100 years old. I asked at that point, when I realized what I had, if I'm not anything else, I'm a person who jumps on resources. And Richard Peterson, I recognized right away, would make a great addition to our panel, so we quickly added a chair, and that's why Richard Peterson's here. Richard, you're from Johnston, Iowa.
I'm from Johnston, yes, sir.
And of course, you don't remember anything. You were born in 1917. And World War I was just underway at the time of your birth. But you did enter World War II. But you must have heard, as you were growing up, and had some of the legacy of World War I from maybe parents. What did you know about World War I, just in a sentence or two? What impressed you about what you heard about World War I?
What I heard about World War I was from the American Legion members in the small town where I eventually lived by my life.
The American Legion.
The American Legion. because they were prominent in that little town. And one of the things that they did was attend the social club meetings that the school had for the community, where they got together and they sang songs and they listened to programs and they listened to the programs that the school could provide, like music groups and so on. So one of the first things I heard there that reminded me of World War II was a song that went in such a way: today is Monday, today is Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, and at the end of it, all you German mothers, we wish the same to you. But it was
was that a friendly song then?
Yes, it was a friendly song. It wasn't anything derogatory about it at all. But the soldiers were leading the community singing, and that was one of the things they seemed to enjoy singing was, today is Monday, all you German mothers, we wish the same to you.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you for the solo, too. The next person here, I also met serendipitously, and he's been a great resource for Iowa Public Television in the time since. But Roger Beau, I first met, I was sitting waiting for a concert to begin, and Roger was seated next to me. We got into a conversation, and I found out he's a Vietnam War veteran from Vinton, Iowa. And Roger, at that time, I realized that you also had some unique experiences, and we'll get into those. But right now, you live in eastern Iowa now.
Yes, I do. And I'd like to give my viewpoint on World War I. As a young boy, my parents would take me out to my great-grand uncle's, and he was a World War I veteran, and we would go there, and I think it was Decoration Day when they would decorate. This was a holiday that preceded our Memorial Day. But he would oftentimes have a fellow soldier who was exposed to mustard gas. And he was very deformed from that, and as a young boy, it scared me to be around him. But that was my introduction to World War I.
Did that also, one more question then, did that also form your opinion of the horrors of war as a young man experiencing that tale and seeing this maybe grotesque person?
Yes. That and conversations with my father, who fought in World War II.
Next in our panel here is a person who has experienced the medical side of it. Heather Dillwood is from Des Moines, right? And what war are you experienced in?
Oh, Afghanistan.
How many tours?
Just one.
And how long in Afghanistan?
I was 10 months in Afghanistan.
And in what role? I said the medical side of it, in what role?
I was a combat medic in Afghanistan from August of 2010 to June of 2011.
Some experiences that we'll get to a bit later. I've not quizzed you about those experiences, but you must have had some.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
I'm looking forward to it. Caesar Smith is right here on my right-hand side. Caesar, you're from Des Moines, and what war are you experienced in?
Vietnam War I was in. Experienced in, I'm not sure exactly how much experience you meant, but I did know many of those in World War II that were in my neighborhood, black soldiers and sailors that came back from World War II. And so that everybody doesn't think I'm the only one up here freezing and shaking. I got Parkinson's, so I'll be shaking all over the place.
Yeah. Let me just delve into that just a bit more. Did you spend time on the ground? I think that you, if I remember right, at your Air Force.
No, I was airborne.
Airborne, okay.
82nd Airborne Division, paratrooper in Vietnam.
Did you do any parachuting into South Vietnam?
No, we used helicopters in Vietnam and landed by helicopter. And of course, we many times were in Agent Orange areas, which caused a lot of diseases, Parkinson's being one of them. But I want to share one thing about World War I because I don't know if it's going to come up, and it's important to those in Iowa. The only officer candidate school for African American officers for World War I was at Fort Des Moines, right here in Des Moines. And all the officers over the infantry units were white, and there was a big push to have some black officers. And I won't go through the whole history of it, but they agreed to have an officer candidate school at Fort Des Moines, and black officers did graduate from that school.
And that, if I remember right, is your experience too. You went into the military as an enlisted person and then went to what we call OCS, or Officer Candidate School.
Yeah, I went in the Army in '56 and went to Officer Candidate School in '62.
And then commissioned as a second lieutenant.
Out of Officer Candidate School, yes.
And then after you left the service, at what rank were you then?
I was a major when I retired.
Major,
I stayed 20 years.
Oh, I see.
And 7 days.
That I know you've been in Vietnam because people count the days who were assigned to Vietnam.
A lot of soldiers count the days, no matter if they're just going in. Just like counting.
Let's go back to the historian here, Mike Vogt. What struck you about your study of World War I and what happened in World War I? What's the thing that contrasts most about the way that perhaps Iowa, you can include the nation too, but Iowa reacted to the call to duty about serving in World War I as to what we're experiencing maybe in the Vietnam War, in the Gulf Wars, and in Afghanistan? What was the overall support? How would you draw similarities or contrasts?
I think there's a little of both. The national support for the doughboys that were mobilized in the First World War, much greater than we wouldn't experience again until World War II. Korea, Vietnam, the modern war on terror, Desert Shield, Desert Storm. The ability for dissent and disagreement with national policy is in higher relief in more recent decades than what was tolerated or what was allowed in the First World War. So that's an interesting aspect. It's a different world. Dissent is not tolerated in the First World War as much as it is today.
The PBS special, The Great War, shows the food sacrifices that were made by Americans, or urged to make, or even compelled to make, shamed to make, if I could put it that way, in order to, quote, support the war effort. We have evolved to a point where those sacrifices that we also experienced during World War II and rationing and things like that, we don't expect that anymore. And I think it was Lyndon Baines Johnson who was justifying the U.S. participation in South Vietnam, who also said, we can have both butter and guns. That is a contrast, isn't it? Is that where things changed about America's being able to not sacrifice in order to fight a war, and also included in that is the compulsory draft? We don't have that anymore.
Correct. I think I'll just state it as a matter of fact. The extent and the participation of the United States in the First and the Second World Wars, agriculturally, industrially, in terms of personnel drafted, 14 million Americans served in the military in the Second World War, 4 million in the First. The succeeding campaigns, even though in Vietnam and Korea the American casualties, the killed number into 52, 53,000, the overall sacrifice to American society, or the impact of those conflicts on American society, was very, very slight compared to the First and the Second World War. It's something that shows up in the newspapers, it shows up on the television, but it's not affecting the dinner table or the crops harvested from the field or the consumption thereof.
I'd like to have other panelists here weigh in. I'm going to call on Heather, first of all, but then I'd like to have all of you weigh in on that as to how you felt about going to war for the United States of America. Were you under compulsion? Were you drafted? Or did you volunteer? And then how did you feel about that? Heather, first of all.
I volunteered. There was a big uptick as far as the Iowa Guard sending soldiers. So I was taking the lesser of two evils. The unit I ended up going with was going to be, their intention was to be an agribusiness team. So I would go as a medic to support those individuals that would be speaking with Afghan locals about their agricultural ways, their practices, things of that nature. So I volunteered because I wanted to be part of that element as opposed to a bigger element.
Was it altruistic? You want to do something for the good of America? Or was it...
I just wanted to do my part. That's all. Mm-hmm. Simple as that.
All right. Roger.
For my part, I volunteered to go in the Air Force simply because I wanted a choice in the matter. The draft was going strong in 1969 when I entered, and there were a lot of bodies coming home, and I thought I'd make a decision that would impact my life.
Richard?
Well, when I attended college at Iowa State in 1935, I was attracted to the military, ROTC people. So I got a commission as a second lieutenant in 1939. And my first military active duty assignment on August 1st of 1941 was to the 92nd Engineer Battalion, which was 1,000 or more colored troops. So there I was as a white officer in a colored battalion with only the chaplain as a colored officer in that time. And so I spent the first 2 years of my active duty training, working with colored troops in different capacities, in different places, and different things.
Let me just say this contrast, because at that time, the era that you're speaking about, we pretty much still were a segregated country.
Yeah, right. And my first active duty, the day after I reported for duty down at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, we got in a truck and moved everybody down into maneuvers into Louisiana and Arkansas during the days when that part of the country was still pretty divided.
Let me explore that just a little bit more before I bring in Caesar. Did you at that time feel that was a good assignment for you? Did you enjoy that? Or was that an assignment to people who were segregated away from the normal and usual military in the United States Army at that time?
Well,
did you feel was it a good assignment?
I didn't know what I was getting into because I was a small town country boy raised on a farm and so on. And there I was with all these people, and I was only one of 23 or 4 officers that was destined to help train them and get them into the military swing.
That's how I felt when I joined the Army and I was among all these white people. When I enlisted for the draft, and this is in '56, and traveled down to Fort Smith, Arkansas, got my uniform, and we all got from Fort Smith, we were going to Fort Knox, Kentucky. There were 5 black soldiers and the rest were white. We got on the buses to go to Fort Knox. We stopped in Louisville, Kentucky for dinner. We all got off the bus and started in the restaurant. As soon as we got in the door, this black waiter said, you, and you, pointed at all of us, said, you got to follow me. And we said, what are you talking about? We're going to eat. He said, no, not now. You got to follow me. We went through the restaurant, through the kitchen, to the other side where it said colored, and that's what we were supposed to eat. That same year, when I went to the 82nd Airborne Division, the great movie, The 10 Commandments, was showing downtown at the movie theater. I was in Army uniform. I went down to see the movie 10 Commandments. I went up to pay, and she said, you have to go around to the side. I went to the side, it said colored. I went upstairs where they had an Army blanket dividing it upstairs, so black people sat on one side, and anybody white could sit on the other side. I hadn't thought about all that growing up in Iowa, although there had been some instances in Iowa, but nothing like that. And so it might have been tough in the 30s, but it was much better in the 50s, and it didn't get much better in the 60s. But by the time I retired from the Army in '76, things had changed quite a bit, but we're still dealing with those kinds of issues. And in terms of my serving in the service, my serving in combat, I was a company commander of a unit that was totally integrated. And I just came back up from Florida, where my radio man and my radio guy in Vietnam, we found each other and spent time together. But it is all service times, whether you're in World War I or through, if you're an African American or a person of color, you had issues that you had to constantly deal with.
And those were issues in addition to that which every man and woman entering the military has to learn, that there's a difference in rank, and rank has its privileges, and usually when you're coming in, you're not at the rank where you're going to be giving orders, you're going to be taking orders. In addition, you had to cope with discrimination, if you will, because of your color.
Yeah.
It wasn't only because of rank, it was because of color.
It was more had to do with color than it did rank.
Oh, yeah, rank didn't even, but you had to deal with two things.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Heather, you didn't have that problem. Of course, you're Caucasian, but you fought and you served at a time when the services are integrated, or are they?
I'd say for the most part, yes. I mean, there's still some areas that women aren't completely welcomed, but it's getting there. But I think, we're all capable of doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. Just depends on the person.
Roger, experienced in Vietnam, we're still talking about racial divides here. What was your experience in serving in Vietnam as far as the races?
Okay. During my time, we didn't have very many people that were colored, and so it wasn't a problem that I saw. In fact, those that were black and that they were friends, and they just worked alongside us, and I didn't know there was any issues while I was there.
I'm just going to go back to the historian just to wrap up this side of our conversation here, and that is the racial divide within the military. Did that at all work positively or negatively in any way?
It worked negatively. If you're told as a soldier that you're not as good as people with lighter skin, that has a psychological effect on your training.
Okay, let me stop right there. Did it, Roger? Did that have a psychological, I'm sorry, Caesar, did that have
I look like Roger.
an effect on you? Did that affect you, the racial discrimination?
Oh, well, when you start off being a black person, you learn early in life it's going to affect you. Matter of fact, you start off and realizing it's going to affect you. There's no time in my life that I didn't know that I was going to run into people who didn't like me just because of the color of my skin. Right. And so that's an issue that's with you from the time you're born.
Did that at all affect the way that you felt about the country for which you were fighting?
No, because growing up, I was fortunate. I was born and grew up in Iowa. I say I was fortunate because I went to integrated schools. Most of the time there were fewer blacks than whites. And in 1954, I went to Boise State. There was 836 of us, I think there, 2 black, and they elected me governor. So I figured they learned something right there.
Heather, I said I was going to get back. I'm going to get back to a lot of you about your individual experiences, but I told you, Heather, that I wanted to come back and talk about your experiences as a combat medic. First of all, let's define that. That's not a nurse and that's not a physician. What is a combat medic?
Typically, they're like an EMT, in a civilian world. We do the stabilization and the primary care for individuals. Depending on your where you're located, in any kind of theater, you could end up practicing medicine as a physician or a nurse or a pharmacist because you're prescribing medication, and so there's a large.
There are no, as in World War I, front lines and trenches now. So in Afghanistan, you didn't experience that. Did you ever experience firefight where you were actually assisting wounded servicemen or women who had been wounded in battle and you were in danger yourself?
Yes. There was convoy that I was on that we had taken direct fire. And so, that was just kind of all of us being hit with RPGs and small arms fire, and then IEDs. But also the base that I was on in Afghanistan was a very small base, but we had a forward surgical team that we were a Role 1 medical facility. So that's where a lot of the people in our region, if there was infantrymen or anyone really that was involved in some kind of engagement and they were injured, they would come to our facility and we would stabilize so we could transport them to a higher echelon of care.
And that's what I wanted to get at. That was the way that in Afghanistan, and that's the way we do it now, you were in the business of stabilizing a wounded service person and getting them to, as you said, a higher level of care.
Yes.
That contrasts with the video that we're seeing about World War I, in which wounded were wounded and stayed in place in the trenches, in knee-deep mud sometimes, and had to be piled upon other dead bodies because just to keep them out of the mud. Is that what you have experienced too in your history research?
Yeah, a number of individuals in the areas between the trenches would become injured, be wounded out there, and that is an area that is prone to sniper fire, machine gun bursts. So oftentimes wounded soldiers would lay for hours or days before somebody could get out there at night to drag them back to safety, or they may die in between the lines out there because nobody can effect a rescue.
One thing about the medics, if you're in a combat situation, I think every soldier is confident that if anything happens to them in terms of being fired on, the medic's going to be there. And the difference between the medic and the rifleman next to him is the medic knows what to do for sure and will do it. And more lives are saved in terms of getting them out by helicopter because the medics did what they needed to do immediately.
Yeah, that's about accurate. We should be doing that. If they're not, it's a bad medic.
There are no bad medics.
But Heather, that means that you've got to call in helicopter evacuation in order to get that wounded person out. Tell me how that works.
Well, typically speaking, it depends on the role of the medic within the unit. If you're just one medic within, a squad or a team, you would probably have another individual call in for a medevac because your primary job is to stabilize or do what you can for your patient. Obviously, if there's many of you many medical personnel, then we can just call it in and with your grid coordinates and what kind of equipment you may need.
And there's a helicopter that comes almost immediately?
Depending, yes. If obviously if you're in a hot area and you're under fire, it'll be some time before you can be evacuated. So it's the medic's responsibility to do what they can for their patient and keep them alive as long as possible until medical support, other, air vacs are
That might have been a
available.
little different than in the jungles of Vietnam. If you had a wounded person, no matter if you were in a hot firefight, the medics would usually try to get in and land. And many times they would land while you were under heavy fire and get out the wounded. They'd have gunships with them, but they had the medic on the ground and the medical team coming in that helicopter you could always depend on.
And then the two of you, we've changed in that we now get that wounded service person out of the combat and maybe even out of the country almost immediately. Tell me how that works. I'll ask you first, Heather, that is where you said to a higher echelon of care. Roger, Caesar, I should say, you move in here too. You move in here too. I want to get to Roger in a minute.
I must be getting awful pale. You keep
Tell me about the higher echelon of care.
It would depend on the wounds that someone had had. Sometimes, they would stay in Afghanistan. They would go to another facility to continue their care, and sometimes even come back to the fight. You would have. It would just depend on the severity of their wounds. They could end up, in Afghanistan. They could end up in Bagram. But if they still go beyond that, then they end up in Germany, and then sometimes
Landstuhl in Germany, and then maybe transferred, stabilized further there, and then back to the States.
Right.
And that, Caesar, I wanted to contrast that with Vietnam, or not contrast it, but that was similar in Vietnam because we quickly evacuated wounded service people out of Vietnam, over the poles, back into generally Andrews Air Force Base in Washington, and then fanned out from there to specialty care.
It would depend on, of course, what's going on in the war in terms of the area you were in. But there were MASH units in Vietnam. There was a major hospital in Tan Son Nhut Air Base.
Yes.
I can remember coming out of the hospital visiting one of my soldiers that got wounded, and a medevac had came in, and they went out on a gurney, I guess it was, to pick up. And the soldier was laying there with his arms and legs next to him, but he was still alive, and they were taking him on into the hospital. So, I mean, the amount of care and the quickness they can get to you with medevac, and like in 24 hours you could be back home if necessary.
That's right. That's right. I myself have met a plane carrying people back into Andrews, and I saw what you are describing here, men still in combat boots. Who had been taken off the battlefield that quickly and back into this country. Richard, I'm going to go back to World War II. We've been talking here about the wounded and what the wounded who were wounded in battle but were still able to be saved. What did you experience? Now, you told me that you experienced in World War II, you weren't in the initial battle of Omaha Beach, but you were there quickly afterwards. So you've seen combat.
No, I wasn't in any position to see or have anything to do with the wounded people and how they were handled. But I have, I think, an interesting connection between World War II and World War I, in that I spent 9 months in France, in one of the barracks in Verdun, France, where the French people had been resisted the German attacks so completely that they didn't overcome the city of Verdun, France. And I was in one of the actual barracks and the forts that they called them casernes for France. That was an interesting, and it was for 9 months, from September of 1944 until May of 1945.
Roger, I haven't gotten to you recently, although I called your name several times. But I do want, we've been talking here about moving wounded and also the deceased back into this country. What have you were based in Thailand for a time?
I was based in Thailand, and the closest I came to combat were F-105s and F-4s that bombed Vietnam. And my experience was occasionally you'd have a plane that didn't come back, or you'd have a plane that came back shot up. The closest thing to a casualty wasn't due to the war, but I think the plane that was taking off probably had some battle damage and it wasn't detected. And we had an F-105 taken off, and it drew my attention because the pilot and co-pilot ejected from this plane. It was fully loaded with fuel, so it continued on down the runway and crashed at the end of the runway. Meanwhile, the pilot and co-pilot were high up in the air, and the wind carried them the length of the runway, and one landed on the grass, and the second guy came down in the ball of fire. And interesting enough, when the plane ejected, they also dropped their bombs on the runway. And I knew the fire control guy who had to go out and pick them up. Now, these bombs had little propellers on the front of them that weren't released until the bomb was released. And the propellers had to make so many revolutions before that bomb was active. Well, he told me that a couple of the bombs only had 2 more revolutions to go. And you just hope you aren't too nervous and make those 2 revolutions.
We're going to wind up our discussion here just in one more question, but I want to go back to you, the historian, Mike Vogt, and talk about a contrast in armaments. Roger has been describing here taking off F-105s based in Thailand, taking off to the run over Hanoi and bombing certain targets there. Many times were shot down, and those pilots, if they lived, were in prison camps. Contrast that with the type of fighting that went on in World War I and the taking of prisoners.
As far as the type of fighting in the air or on the ground?
Not air, but armaments that were being used, number one, and then the taking of prisoners.
In the First World War, not only nations, but economies and scientists and physicists go to war as well. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, the same types of technological achievements that gave us automobiles and telephones, etc., increased the killing power and the fire capacity of the weapons that are carried by the armies into combat in World War I. Machine guns, magazine rifles, rapid fire artillery, high explosive shells take a tremendous toll in human life, more than any prior conflict. By the end of the First World War, 8 million soldiers from all the combatant nations had died. Poison gas is unveiled as a weapon by the Germans in the spring of 1915. So the capacity to inflict dreadful wounds and to kill enemy soldiers is many times beyond what any warring nations had experienced prior to that time.
I believe that my service was brought about because of change in the war. Prior to mine being sent over to Thailand, the U.S. experienced a lot of our planes were being shot down by SAM missiles.
Surface-to-air missiles.
Right, surface-to-air missiles. And my career field was electronic countermeasures. And what that meant was we had equipment on the airplanes that detected the presence of SAMs and could tell the pilot or the backseat operator where the SAM was and where it was coming from and if they were the target. And with this information, they could avoid being struck by the SAM.
Take evasive measures.
Take evasive measures.
Yes, Caesar?
Since we're getting close to finish wrapping up, I think it's important to talk about, Mike might add something to it. Women have always been a part of the military, all the way from the Revolutionary War all the way up through what we're doing now. But they were all volunteer bases. All the nurses, et cetera, in World War I were volunteer bases. Women didn't get an opportunity to be a part of it the way they should until World War II, and the first women to come into the service came in at Fort Des Moines, 1942, when they had the Women's Army Corps. I was a little kid, but I remember all the women that were in town during that period that they started training out at Fort Des Moines. And from that beginning, from the Revolutionary War, when they were out helping, all the way up to now, I think everybody in here ought to give Heather a hand, because being a medic in the combat is really a tough situation.
Heather, I'm going to have you respond to that compliment and maybe give us some personal experiences about being a woman serving as a medic, and then Mike, wind up that thought, if you will, about women's service, and then we'll have a final question.
You know, I've obviously, as a female, even now, you still meet some resistance in some regards, but as a medic, I think women, you know, we have that compassion. I don't know, I think we're all capable of doing it all. I'm kind of speechless right now. You kind of caught me off guard, which is really weird for me. I'm glad that we get the opportunity to serve just like everybody else, because we're all capable of doing it. And I'm glad that we're getting to the, you know, the military is getting to the point that it's opening its doors for women to serve everywhere. We may not be capable of doing it, just like some men aren't capable of doing some of the jobs women are better at, but at least the opportunity is there. And, you know, I'm glad that we've gotten to that point. And it's really been an honor for me to be, you know, to serve as a medic as long as I did. And especially in Afghanistan, to have had the opportunities to be even a small part of people's lives and help them the best that I could.
Michael, was it a long, hard role? Women were just getting the vote in 1919. During World War I, they didn't even have the vote yet. So they weren't really serving. Were they in the military at that time? And so how did that evolve? And we're still assimilating now and adjusting to getting women into combat roles. What was the evolution and the thinking on that over the years?
There's an old saying that an army is a reflection of the society from which it comes. And so the same difficulties and discriminations that people of color or females faced in their own society are carried, are endured in the military as well. The Army developed the Army Nurse Corps, drawing on lessons from the Spanish-American War in the first decade of the 20th century. In World War I, a great number of Red Cross personnel, civilian personnel, were served in hospital and nursing capacities in France and in the United States. So they're part of the war effort, but when it comes to studying the First World War, we see images of doughboys, but rarely do we see those nurses or those medical personnel behind the scenes.
Yeah. I'd be remiss, Richard, if I didn't bring you into this conversation, because during World War II, where you served, we had the waves, the WACs,
Yeah, right.
and maybe WAFs also, women in Air Force.
Yeah.
Tell me how those service people were regarded at that time in World War II.
I probably was lucky in not really having any attachment to those people. The only attachment I got to were the ladies that run the donut shop, the donut trucks. The Red Cross ladies that run the donut truck, and because they were quartered when they were not out with the troops, they were in that same area that I was in Verdun.
Yeah.
Yep.
And that says something too, doesn't it, Mike? the area where he served, he didn't have any contact with the Women Corps that I mentioned.
And the women's originally, well, the organization founded at Fort Des Moines that Caesar mentioned prior, was originally created as the Women's Auxiliary, or Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, WAC with 2 A's. The program was so successful that when it was suggested that they be deployed overseas, the Congress said, well, wait a minute, there was nothing about sending them overseas as an auxiliary component. And that's when they got rid of the auxiliary and they became the Women's Army Corps with equal pay, equal rank, equal military courtesy. And they are deployed overseas to do jobs, everything from clerks to mechanics to small arms inspectors. And so they make a significant contribution to the war effort.
And that's the acronym that I cited, WACS. That's how they were known, Women's Army Corps. What did WAVE stand for?
Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service, and they were the Navy component.
Yes.
The Marines had Marines. They didn't have any kind of an acronym. Women Marines were Women Marines, and the Coast Guard had SPARs from their organizational, I think it's Semper Paratus is a Latin phrase that SPAR comes from.
Final question that I want is, we're going to wind up here. How did these wars wind up? The basic question that I want from you is your experience and recollection in how you were assimilated back into society. And Caesar already is laughing, so he's got a story to tell, and I know that Roger does. But how you were assimilated back into society, was it with ticker tape parades, or was it in some other manner? And I'm going to we'll start with you, because you go back the furthest, Richard, in World War II. How did you come back to this country? And what kind of a reception did you get here? Because I know that this nation created all sorts of benefits for you who served in World War II. They had college tuition for you. They had other benefits that we'd never seen before. But what did you feel about having served and then coming out and adjusting to civilian life?
Well, I happen to have been ordered back from overseas to be on the staff of the commandant of the engineer school in Fort Belvoir. But we were home on leave when the big bomb fell in Japan. So when we went back, there wasn't anything for me to do but to just come back. There was no reception, there was nothing. We just happened to have been, in Paris for the excitement after the end of that part of it. Came back to Des Moines, we happened to be here when Japan, but I went back to my work at the Iowa Power and Light Company, and there was no reception, nothing big, never has been, really.
Did you use the GI Bill benefits?
No, I could have gone back to college because I had a few hours to recover from, because I got out a little early, but I didn't use any of the GI benefits.
And let's go then to Caesar. What was the reception that you experienced?
Well, I want to go back a second before I get to mine. After World War I, they had great parades. Black soldiers in that one unit we saw in the movie, they came back to the States. They marched in New York City, all across the country. There was a lot of celebration. But the black soldiers didn't come back to anything different than it was before the war, which is very disappointing. Equality didn't change after World War I, even though they fought in World War I. Equality didn't change after World War II, even though they fought in World War II. There's something strange about the wonderful people of our country when it comes to what they feel about individuals and why they feel that way. Because there wasn't any acceptance at all for those of us coming back from Vietnam. My foreign observer, when he came back, he got spit on for being a soldier, and all the soldier's doing is what he's supposed to do, is what he's told to do. And yet they wanted to take it out on the soldier. So reception coming back, to me, I wasn't expecting anything. I didn't get anything. So That's the way it was. I did have one interesting thing on the plane. I was flying in from Hawaii back to the States, and a civilian guy was sitting next to me, and he said, and I was in uniform, he said, "What do you think about this crap they're talking about women being in combat? You been in combat?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, would you want a woman in combat with you?" And I said, "Anybody who's willing to fight, I'd be willing to have them next to me. I don't have any problem with it being a woman or a man." And he looked at me like, "You don't know what you're talking about." So that was the reception I think I got in terms of coming back to the States. I've seen some improvement, but overall, I think everybody knows we got a long way to go in terms of accepting everybody. Because one of the irritating things about seeing in that film during World War I, when they're talking about immigrants and talking so bad about the Germans, of course we know what they did with the Japanese during World War II, and here we are now in 2017, we're still doing the same kind of crap in terms of who's an American. It's really strange when we don't know who an American is.
On my drive out here today, I passed a Islamic religious center, and there was a pot of flowers outside, and in that flower pot was a sign about this big with an American flag on it that said, "We support you." And I got to thinking about that during the film. I think we've come a long way in terms of race relations, including women and others in the military, but I'm not totally convinced we have still escaped the long shadows that were cast at that time in the First World War.
I want to come back to you just to wrap up our thought here on assimilation and contrast the wars, if you will. Roger, you came back from Vietnam.
Well, I didn't come back from Vietnam. I came back
Thailand.
from Thailand.
Yes. Vietnam, worst time.
When I reached Travis Air Force Base, I was discharged from the service.
Travis is in Northern California.
Right. And after getting my discharge papers, I grabbed a cab in the late afternoon to the air base to fly home, Los Angeles. And when my cab pulled up, there's another cab that pulled up behind me that an Army guy got out of. And there was a war protest going on.
Now, were you in uniform?
I was in uniform, and I was carrying a duffel bag, and we became the object of the war protest. So we got shoulder to shoulder, and we had to wade through this war protest while they were spitting on us and hitting us with signs. And one woman came up and hacked in this soldier's face. And when we got to the doors of the terminal, the police were on the other side of the doors, and they controlled access, and they let us in. And much to my surprise, they were angry, and they escorted us to a room, and we were ordered to stay there until our flight left.
Just for your own protection?
Just for our protection, and probably not to cause any more riots.
Yeah.
But
Let me just, okay, you had something more to say.
well, I think I need to tell you the rest of the story. I got on the plane, and it was late in the evening, and my next stop was Minneapolis, Minnesota. When I got to Minneapolis, Minnesota, it was after midnight, and I and the fellow passengers retrieved our luggage, and I was left there to wander the corridors, which were darkened, and there wasn't a soul around. And I'm walking down this corridor, and out from a side corridor, this guy steps out, and the place just echoed. He said, "Are you a GI?" And I said, "Yes." He said, "Would you come here?" That scared me to the boots. So I walked down, and he says, "I have a cot for you."
Because you had to spend the night.
Because I had to spend the night, and after flying back from Southeast Asia, the barracks that they put me up in that first night was full of guys that were getting out, and they were celebrating all night, so there wasn't much sleep there. And so I got some needed rest, and the next thing I knew, he shook me awake, and he said, "Your plane's leaving." Grabbed my stuff, and here they held the plane for me. And then I got on, and the most amazing thing that happened, we took off. It was foggy, and we got above the clouds, and it was bright. This was August of '72, and I looked down, and it was like the Garden of Eden coming home.
I can identify with that, not that I experienced that, but I saw it. I mentioned meeting the C-5 at Andrews Air Force Base at about 3:30, 4 o'clock one morning. You can imagine how empty the runway and the taxiways there are at that time. The C-5 pulls up finally, the door comes down, and I walk into that plane and just see stretcher upon stretcher piled high, just having loaded at Tan Son Nhut in South Vietnam, and then flying over the poles, landing at Andrews. And one of the most meaningful things that I'll never forget, and it goes to the emotion that you were just showing here about that story, is a nurse saying to one of the GIs on one of those litters, and there was all kinds of moaning that you can imagine in that plane as I walked in, and that very eerie feeling. And she said, "You're okay, you're okay, you're home." And what a meaningful statement that was. Heather, what was your experience coming back?
Well, for the Guard, and I think active duty is similar, we fly into a demobilization base. So we have to go somewhere, they demobilize us, and we have doctor's appointments and things, and then we come back to the state, and there's a ceremony, and we get information, and they have music and speakers, and they welcome us home, and your families are welcome to be a part of it. I mean, it's pretty amazing to be part of it, and it's very emotional to have all of that support and to finally be back.
You didn't encounter any hostility that you've heard described here?
No, I've never, in all my years being in, I've never encountered it.
In fact, have you ever had people come to you and say, "Thank you for your service"?
Yes, multiple times. It's always a little weird.
And Michael, it's always a little weird?
Yeah, oh yeah, because you don't know what to say. I mean, we don't do it because we want the thanks, we do it because we're proud to do it. We do it because we want to.
Mike, you've heard the stories here. Just wrap it up for us on you're okay, you're home. What did people experience contrasted over the war, over the years, and why did it change?
The victorious armies, sailors, Marines that arrived home in the First World War, as Caesar indicated, they were met with parades and some fanfare. There was a big parade for the 168 Infantry, the Iowa National Guard, down Grand Avenue through a Victory Arch, and they posed on the grounds of the Capitol to have their photo taken. That Capitol hangs opposite the governor's office at the state capitol, if you want to see what that image looks like. World War II, there was a great degree of fanfare for those that were able to participate. And, but Korea, Vietnam, and other struggles around the world have been more, I hate to use Harry Truman's phrase, but they've been more police actions. They've been limited in scope, not for the veterans that have to participate in the war. It's war just the same. But these limited actions, fighting guerrillas, fighting insurgencies, the sense of it being over, the sense to, the feeling to want to celebrate, just hasn't been there.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights and your experiences. It's just been enlightening for me, and I know for those of you who are watching. And we've been listening here to Mike Vogt down on the end. We have Richard Peterson, Roger Beau, Heather Dillwood, and Caesar Smith. I'm Dean Borg, and I just want to remind you that on Iowa Public Television, as a part of the PBS series that's coming now on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday from 8 o'clock at night until 10 o'clock at night, 2 hours each night on those 3 nights this week, The Great War. Thank you.